In 1789, Martha Washington became the first, albeit not an official title, First Lady of the United States. The role of First Lady was previously undefined, and it was up to Martha to establish what the wife of a president should do with her time while her spouse was in office. But prior to that, Martha was just a regular plantation girl from Virginia. Martha Washington, née Dandridge, was born on June 2, 1731, at Chestnut Grove, a plantation in New Kent County, Virginia. Her father, John Dandridge, was an immigrant to the United States from England and worked as a count clerk and militia officer. Martha was the eldest of 8 children and had 3 younger brothers and 4 younger sisters. Growing up, Martha did not receive a formal education, but her upbringing did include typical female-dominated tasks of the time, including housekeeping, religion, music, needlework, and dancing. She also learned to read and write, which would not necessarily have been common for girls during that time. This training was also designed to prepare her for an eventual role as the wife of a Virginia plantation owner. Religion was particularly important to Martha. She would regularly spend an hour every day studying the Bible and praying. As an adult, Martha was approximately 5 feet tall. She had brown hair and brown or hazel eyes according to portraits painted of her during that time. As a teenager, Martha became involved with a man named Daniel Parke Custis. He was 20 years her senior, but was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in Virginia. The Custis family, especially Daniel's father, was against the match since Martha did not come from a wealthy enough family. It wasn't until after he met her and became enamored with Martha's personality that he finally gave his consent. They were married in 1750 and lived in a plantation that was ironically called the White House, located in New Kent County, Virginia. Together they had 4 children, Daniel in 1751, Francis in 1753, John in 1754, and Martha in 1756. But unfortunately 2 of them, Daniel and Francis, passed away before reaching 5 years old, and the other 2 died before their mother as well. Martha endured much tragedy at the loss of her children early in her marriage, but then also suffered through losing her husband in 1757, just 7 years after they were wed. At age 26, Martha was now a widow. She was left with a substantial amount of money, a large plantation, and 300 slaves. Under English law, Martha could own property because she was a widow. As a married woman, this would not have been permitted. She was considered a talented businesswoman when she took over plantation operations, conducting trades and deals and holding suppliers from England to a high standard. In 1758, a year after Daniel died, 2 men began courting Martha, a man named Charles Carter and George Washington. George came to visit Martha twice in March of 1758. Historians cannot confirm if this was the first time Martha and George met, however, as they had many overlapping friends and acquaintances. There is no clear record of the exact first meeting between the pair, which might have been before Martha was a widow. In January 1759, George and Martha wed at her home in New Kent. The next 16 years of Martha's life is often referred to as the Golden Years. By the end of April that year, the couple had relocated to Washington's Mount Vernon home with Martha's 2 surviving children and enslaved workers. The couple would never have children of their own, but George was a dedicated stepfather to Martha's 2 children and later to her grandchildren. George became very active in local politics, and Martha was engaged raising her children and overseeing plantation operations. Her daughter Martha, who was called Patsy by the family, suffered from epilepsy, however, and despite seeking the best treatments available at the time, Patsy died in 1773. She was just 17 years old at the time. Martha was a major supporter of the Revolutionary War. In 1775, Martha received a letter from Washington saying that he had been made the commander of the American military forces. Martha stayed at Mount Vernon with Washington's cousin, Lund Washington, to manage the estate. Martha, however, also spent much of the war with her husband in the camps or nearby. When she visited, Martha would knit for the soldiers, visit the hospitals, and raise money with other wives to purchase shirts and supplies for the soldiers. By 1780, her efforts became so well known, she almost had a symbolic role for the American people. Vendors sold her engraved portrait, children were named after her, and at least 2 ships bore her name as well. In 1781, sadness came again to Martha when her last remaining son, John, died at age 27. He left behind his wife and 4 children. On Christmas Eve, 1783, George Washington resigned from his military commission and returned to Mount Vernon. For the next 6 years, the Washingtons helped raise their 2 grandchildren. After the war, the Washingtons were very well known and received hundreds of guests at their home during this time, even though Martha was sick for a large portion of 1785. George had risen to international notoriety, and the workload for Martha only increased. In 1789, the people called on George Washington to lead as president. Martha was not enthusiastic to take on another public role, complaining that she felt like a state prisoner. However, when George departed Mount Vernon for New York, Martha would follow a month later. The first family, including Martha, Nellie, Washing, and a nephew, took an 11-day trip to New York and moved into No. 3 Cherry Street. By 1790, the family relocated to the Macomb House so they could have more space. As First Lady, Martha hosted Friday evening receptions for members of Congress, dignitaries, and men and women from the local community, in addition to the responsibilities as the First Lady. She was also managing Mount Vernon from a distance. The formality of city life was very different from Martha, who lived in an agricultural setting for most of her life. She was very aware of how her actions would set a precedent for how future First Ladies would behave and the expectations for the role. At first, she had critics who believed some of her events radiated the opulence of royalty, which America had just fought to remove, but they found her to be a warm person and responsive to their needs. Her attention to bringing varying groups together, including men and women, made her an object of veneration and respect. In 1797, George Washington retired from the presidency and his family returned to Mount Vernon. In 1799, George Washington passed away and left Martha as a widow again. She was so heartbroken, she didn't attend his funeral on December 18th. She moved from their bedroom to a smaller room on the 3rd floor of the mansion. Despite her grief, Martha, an ever-dutiful former First Lady, welcomed mourners at the home wishing to pay their respects. In 1800, Martha prepared her will and ensured she fulfilled the wishes of George Washington's will, which included a deed on manumission to emancipate his enslaved individuals on January 1, 1901. Martha continued to mourn her lost husband and burned much of their correspondence during that time. On March 22, 1802, Martha Washington died. Thank you for joining me on this initial tribute to First Ladies of the United States. Please stay tuned for episode 2 coming soon.